Hey everyone, thank you for being here. It's such an exciting day with Godot talks, and you're all coming to a talk of a lawyer, so I'm very happy to see you all. My name is René Otto, and I'm a games lawyer in the Netherlands. I work with around 250 developers and publishers, and founded my own law firm focusing exclusively on games. And the reason for that is that I actually wanted to be someone like you, being able to make games, but unfortunately I can't, despite games having a large role in my life. So I went on getting a law degree and do games or legal for games. Next to that, I try to contribute to the industry in different capacities. So I'm a secretary at Breda Game City, which is an organization which tries to elevate the game industry in the region of Breda. I'm a mentor at the Dutch Games Association, where I try to help indies with business and legal stuff. I'm a member of the advisory board at GameHeart, which is a European research focusing on the impact of the European games industry from a social, cultural and economic perspective. And last but not least, I'm active as an ambassador for women in games, because I believe that diversity is important. I saw a few less fun situations happening in the industry, and as a lawyer I helped them pro bono, but then I thought, like, I want to proactively contribute to make a change. About Deviant Legal, well, it's a boutique firm focusing on games, and we try to be an industry ally, trying to make top quality legal solutions accessible for everyone, and that's a core value of us. So we believe that lawyers shouldn't be formal, distant and dusty, but should be accessible and also financially. So what we try to do is we give away 4 hours a week with free legal advice for people, so that we can make sure that everyone can have their questions answered. And we work remote, and that has a few advantages. One, it makes us easily scalable, and we're operating internationally. So we also have freelancers in different European countries, making sure that we can answer every question you have within Europe. And because we're remote and we don't have big real estate, we're also cheaper than competitors. And these are the ways we work. I'll keep it short, but we work on demand, but also more on a retainer based if people have like specific legal needs. And if we look at today, we have various topics. The first one is that I will talk a little bit about the legal aspects of open source, just a short intro so that everyone is on the same page. And then I will look at 2 topics. The first topic being, like, if you want to contribute to Godot, what do you need to watch out for in your employment agreement or your freelance agreement? And then we go to the main topic, which is the Godot engine and contract. So if you build a game made in Godot, how can you make sure, and what do you need to watch out for in your publishing agreements and your work for hire agreements? And of course, there are a lot of topics relevant to those agreements, but I will specifically focus only on when you use open source software. And then we end with an Ask Me Anything or a Q&A. Also, during this talk, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. And if you believe that you have questions which are more sensitive and more personal, feel free to reach out to me after this talk and we can have a one-on-one, because I can also imagine with legal that sometimes you can ask a question and everyone is allowed to know, and sometimes it isn't. Well, open source. Everyone in this room knows what open source is, but from a legal perspective, it's important to know that open source software is still copyright protected, because as soon as you make something creative, an own creative work, it is copyright protected. The only difference is that there is a large open community that actually owns the software, because every of your contributions is actually owned by you, but licensed via the community to end users. And open source is always for free. You can use it very broadly, and the license conditions are often standardized and have few limitations. So I hear a lot of developers say, like, hey, it's open source, it's not protected. Yes, it is, but via the license conditions, it's very open and broad. So if you compare it to proprietary software, which is of course the opposite of open source software, there are some differences. if you look at open source software, like I said, it's community owned and community licensed. So there's no one central licenser as a contracting party, but an unidentifiable group of licensors, which lawyers believe is scary because you don't have one party to say like, hey, you did something wrong, or hey, your engine doesn't work. Look, if you look at proprietary software, it's privately owned and licensed. So there's one party who licensed and who owns it. But if you look at it from a license perspective, well, open source is often permissive, so you can do almost whatever you want with the license. While if you look at more traditional software, it's way more restrictive. Regarding security and support, there is a theory and a practice. If you look at open source in theory, you can say, yeah, it depends on the community participating and sourcing. So that sounds a little bit more risky because there's no commercial incentive, and there's a possibility that SDKs are abandoned, but everyone is really enthusiastic in making it work. So it can also be, in practice, a way better solution. And if you look at proprietary software, you can say, hey, it's a commercial company, and they will look at the client needs because otherwise they don't earn any money. But there's also the risk of abuse of power of big tech. I mean, a lot of EU tech regulation is because of the abuse of power of big tech. And we all know what an engine did last year, which I won't mention. If you look at the cost of use, open source, often free. Proprietary software, often paid, can be free, but it doesn't happen that much. Well, if you look at open source, there are thousands of licenses, which is, of course, logically, because licenses of open source combines the two biggest groups of stubborn people together, and that are programmers and lawyers. So there are thousands of different licenses. But if you look at it, there are three main categories. The first one is the permissive license. So there you only need to provide a copyright and permission notice, and you can do almost anything you want. You have what they call the weak copyleft license, and copyleft is a fancy name because we have, of course, copyright, which is protected. And idealistic, we look at copyleft as opposite of copyright, because you can do whatever you want, almost. There you also have the copyright and permission notice, and you have the obligation that if you amend the open software, you make modified versions available, you do it under the same license, which essentially means if you change something to open source, you also need to distribute that open source. And then you have the third one, which is the strong copyleft license, which is often the GPL. Then you have to do all the former, but it's also if you make a derivative work, you also need to make that derivative work available open source. And that's something that a lot of parties believe is scary because essentially, for example, a game can also be a derivative work. And that should also mean like, hey, I spent 3 years building a game, and now I need to make that game available open source. So there is, if you hear a lot of people being scared about open source, it's actually scared of strong copyleft. Well, then you have the Godot license, which is an MIT license, essentially saying you need to put a text in your documentation and potentially in the credits, but you can almost do whatever you want. And it's provided as is. So if there's something wrong with Godot, yeah, it's your own responsibility. Of course, that's logical because it's open source. It's a community contribution. So essentially, there is no liability involved. Well, if you, yeah, my favorite character, I even like once considered standing here in a Godot cosplay, but that was a little bit too much for this talk. So I used some images of him left and right just to plug him. But if you want to contribute to Godot and you have an employment relationship, you need to check a few things. So if you use Godot in your work, your actual work, then you need to obtain the approval of your employer to provide the edits, which you then license under the MIT license. The reason for that is that copyright normally arises with the creator, which is you, but in a lot of countries worldwide, there is an exception that if you are employed and you do something in the context of your employment, then it's owned by your employer. So if you make edits to Godot and then distribute it, then your employer can say, hey, I own that, you weren't allowed to do that. But if you only work with Godot in your own time, you're fully free to contribute to the Godot community. But there are two things you need to check in your agreements, which are the prohibition of ancillary activities and the IP clause. Well, ancillary activities, that's that clause in the employment agreement that you can't do paid or unpaid activities next to your employment without approval of your employer. That's different than a non-compete, because a non-compete is often the period after you leave your job. This is during your job. And there's one good thing to know, is that if you live or work in Europe, then such clauses are heavily restricted. Because we have an European directive on transparent and predictable working conditions, and an employer can't prohibit you from doing it, except in cases they have an objective reason. And an objective reason is that if you work 40 hours at an employer, or even 50, and you think, let's do another 30 hours per week in Godot, and you get burned out, that could be an objective reason. But also, potentially, you're making something similar. Like you work at Vertigo Games, they make zombie shooters, and you think, you know what? I'm going to make zombie shooters in my spare time. Then you can be a competitor of your own employer, which they perhaps can prohibit. The other thing you need to watch out for is the IP clause in your contract, because I said everything that's made in the context of your employment is owned by the employer. That's by law. But there's also, of course, the contract. And what you sometimes see, and I hear a lot of horror stories about this, is that in your employment agreement, there could be a clause that everything that's made in your spare time as a developer is owned by the studio. To be honest, as a lawyer, I don't think that's really enforceable, but check before and at least evaluate this, because you don't want to have a discussion which you could have avoided. If you work as a freelancer, well, of course, if you do it outside of your freelancing work, there's no problem. You're a freelancer in the end. If you work with Godot during your freelance work, there are some things to keep in mind. If the IP is not transferred, no problem, but I always say, talk at least with your client, because sometimes they feel a bit screwed if they then see that some tools or SDKs are shared, which you made for them. If the IP is transferred, you need to make sure that there is a carve-out. So if you, for example, make a level in Godot, and during making that level, you also created some tools, some SDKs and whatsoever, it's important to have that carved out in the contract. Because otherwise, your client could say like, hey, the IP is transferred to me, so you weren't allowed to do that. And of course, it's important for the Godot community as well to not have such discussions. Well, and then we are contributing to Godot. We have commercial contracts. And of course, I can talk hours and hours about everything that's right and wrong about contracts. However, next to those points, you also have some points of attention from the perspective of open source. And that's the open source clause, the third-party software clause, your service level agreement and or technical support, and the warranties. Well, and we have a toolkit for all these kind of things. The first tool we can always use is the carve-out. I already briefly mentioned it, but the carve-out is just making, in the text of the agreement, an exclusion for this specific situation. You have the knowledge qualifiers. So then you don't promise there's no open source, but you say, as far as I know, there's no open source, for example, which makes something way softer. And then you have something like the best efforts obligation, which actually means like if you have a warranty or a guarantee, you legally pinky promise that something is the case. While if you make it a best effort, then you say, I will make a best effort that this is the case. So I will do my best, but if in the end it doesn't work, I'm sorry. So you should at least check and use these tools whenever convenient. Well, if you look at the open source clause, like I said before, there are some commercial parties scared of open source, and that's actually because of that hard copy left, which leads to a clause like this. It's like the developer represents and warrants to publisher or client that the game does not include any portion of any open source software. So we don't want any software, open source software in our product, which if you develop something with Godot is a bit hard. And of course, you don't want you don't want any discussions about this. So one alternative I often use is like developer represents and warrants that any use of any open source software in the game, when used as anticipated by this agreement, will not require any part of the game to be distributable only under open source software license. So what it says here in legalese, it's just like there's no hard copy left here, which applies. Then you have the third-party software clause. It is resembling a bit with the open software clause, but it's just a clause where it requires you to disclose that you're using third-party software or even pre-approve it. So you have a list of approved third-party software. And what I see a lot in practice is that there are a lot of developers forgetting to mention that they use Godot. Why are they forgetting it? Because they're thinking, well, I can do everything with it what I want. And third-party software clauses, that's especially for like proprietary software where there are huge license conditions and fees. So there's no problem, right? However, there are a lot of publishers or clients who don't have the knowledge of Godot, for example. They have an in-house Unity team which can be used, but Godot, well, they can't amend it, they can't port it, and they require way more like new parties like W4 Games who can actually do the porting. So it's still important to mention it because it can lead to friction. And then you, of course, have the SLA/bug fixing. I mentioned it at the start of my lecture. It's sometimes it's easier to have things which are wrong with the engine fixed, but it can also be a bit harder, and then you have no one party to reach out to. So, well, it's dependent on the community effort, and that also means in your contract, you need to watch out what you're really promising for. And clients and publishers will often in these negotiations state like, you're using open software, then you shouldn't use open software. So to be honest, I don't want any carve out, I don't want any best effort, I don't want everything else. But still, it's something that you should at least try and talk about because hard commitments can be legally risky, especially if there are like new versions of operating software available or something else. So what I always try to do is that, I will fix bugs within the SLA, so within so many days after a notification. But if the source of the bug or the technical error is based on the fact that it's the open source engine, then we have a longer waiting time and a solution time. Or we enter into negotiations how we're going to fix this. Or a best efforts clause. If there is a technical error and it's associated with my open source software, I will do my best, man, to fix it. But I can't really promise it. Well, and with this, I'm almost at the end of my lecture because I want to have enough time for Q&A. But when I prepared my slides for this lecture, which I did last night, by the way, I thought, what's going to be fun? I'm going to be an open source lawyer. So if you want like all the clauses and the carve-outs, which I just discussed, send me an email, tell me which one you would like to receive, and I will provide it to you under an MIT license. I perhaps will also try to make it public via Godot, but still looking into that. But I believe that everyone should have access to at least these kind of clauses to make sure that if you are entering into contracts and you don't have the time or the money to engage a lawyer, you can at least cover this for yourself. And with that, I'm at the M&A, Q&A part. M&A is like a different thing in legal. So ask me anything or Q&A.
Wait, if the classes are under MIT, like if one writes a contract, are they going? Do they have to credit you?
Oh no! It's just if you share it further, because of course I will need to put in some kind of a warranty where I say like, hey, understand that these are standard clauses and that I can't accept any liability, but they're used for reference. So same with Godot. Of course, normally you need to like include it in the documentation or somewhere else. That's a little bit different. So it's an MIT 2.0 because lawyers don't use it that often. But it's just that you share it with others in the same document I did, so that I can at least tell them like, hey, I drafted them. If you have questions, reach out to me. But please know that they are not like tailor-made for your personal situations. Because what I see a lot is that there are developers who Google, find a contract, use it, don't think twice if it actually applies to them. And then, they, for example, they're a company who will do a pro freelancer contract. And I see that contract, I'm like, wow, you could just better not enter into a contract because this is even worse. So to prevent that, a little bit of FYI. And there is a risk, of course, that these clauses are like copy-pasted everywhere. And it's like, oh, René did them and they're always well without that disclaimer. And I'm a bit like wary of that.
So if at my work I make something and then I push it to Godot and then my company is like, you should not have done that. Like, but now it's pushed and online. Like, who is in trouble? I guess it goes to me, right? Like, it's not.
Yeah, there's potentially to you, but to be honest, it doesn't happen that much. But theoretically, it can.
I think first of all, thanks for being so open about it. Like, especially from like everything I've ever had done with legal, it was the exact opposite. So thanks a lot for this. And my question is, might be covered by your toolkit. We have the situation that we have a friend that sounds for us, so we want to be legally sound to own the IP or rights or whatever, but we don't want to give him like a contract where he can't use it anymore. And I found it really hard to find any ethical contract kind of thing. I'm not sure if there's any resources or your toolkit to cover these kind of things.
No, more than happy to help you with that. What you often see is that contributors do transfer the IP because you want to own it and want to have the availability. But what I then often see is a license back for certain purposes. You can use it in your portfolio. If you want to do your greatest hits album, you're allowed to do that and retain everything. And if you use it, it can be even a broad license back. And what you then often agree upon is that you won't use that license, for example, as an audio person, in a way where it could be harmful for the game. So you say you don't put it in any other game, but if you want to license it for different purposes, you can do that because you don't want to be surprised that, for example, there are the American elections and you hear the music about your game being used in the next debate. And you're like, well, now everyone associates that music with Trump and Harris. You don't want to do that, so of course you need to have something in there that you say like, don't do stupid things.
Thank you for the talk also. And I'm a little bit confused about a specific part of the MIT license where it says substantial portions of this software product. And so I'm always confused when I think, okay, if I reuse a certain script in a commercial product and make some modifications to it, technically I only own the modifications, right? And the original code is still under MIT. But how do I specify that and include that in the copyright notice that I mean, I have to paste this somewhere, right?
Yeah, you need to paste it. Sometimes you do it in the documentation, just like in the file. Sometimes you even put it in the credits. You have a Godot logo and then have this remark. But then you can at least make sure, like, you know, every modifications are owned by us and also the license, for example, are provided, because that's also the thing with the MIT license. You're not obliged to make those tools available. It's nice and everyone will appreciate it in this room, but you're not really you don't have to do that. So you just need to make sure that in your own copyright notice, like at the end of the game, it's like copyrighted by your studio. And for example, also a few tools are copyrighted by us. But then again, copyright arises as soon as you make something. So it's not even really needed to have copyright onto something. It's just like a warning sign or just like an FYI sign. And for MIT licenses, it's really important to have that notice because, of course, there's no one licensee. It's openly licensed, so everyone who uses it needs to know. For your own, it's just like you can, like your game or your own tooling are copyrighted by me. And if you forget it, then again, it doesn't have any risk whatsoever.
All right, thank you.
Hi, also thank you for the very nice talk. I'm interested about when I push some code and make it open source. At least in Europe, I don't think that you can do any patents with source code, right? But could there be an issue with patents in, for example, America or something that I could violate without even knowing it?
Potentially, yes. It's right that in Europe, software isn't as such is not patentable. It's like protected under copyright, which means that you can make something similar but don't use the code of someone else. If you look at the USA and Japan, then software can be patentable. So potentially, if you distribute it in that region, it could be an infringement. You currently see that also with the whole Pokemon versus Palworld discussion. Why is it only in Japan? Because there is a patent, and in the USA they tried to register it, but it was rejected and there's still an appeal. So that's why it's still only in Japan. But it could be the case. To be honest, I don't want to make anyone scared. At one point, take it seriously, of course. At the same time, what I often see is that people want to cease and desist and want to say like, hey, it's an infringement, so don't use it anymore in our region where I have protection. But if you then not make it available anymore or whatsoever, you quite often see that people stop because, of course, they can claim damages, but what will be the damage actually, which is really hard to demonstrate. So please remain creative, remain making tools, be wary about it, but don't be awake at night about it. And by the way, if I don't look at anyone during a question, that's because of the light. So I see like a very group of silhouettes. It's no arrogance. It's really like I might look at you or I might not look at you. So
I seem to be the legal guy in the crowd now. One thing I always wondered about the MIT license more and more is like, there's like the copy should be included, and this is so like, is it in the credits? Is it a file next to the exe, or does it not matter? Like.
Yeah, I often recommend doing both. So if you have someone else who just look at the documentation of the game or the technical part, it's good to have it in there. But you quite often it's also good to have it in the credits because then it's also clear for the end users. I must say I play a game and when I completed the game I just shelve it again or whatsoever. But there are people who like to mod or do something else, and then it's good to have that like short MIT license in there as well. Same you see, for example, if you ever watch the movie Cars, then you have like thousands of copyright notices from Mercedes, from BMW, from all other companies, just to make sure what the license conditions are. So I would say do both, unless there are really reasons not to.
Hi, thank you for the talk also. I had a question just on your last point. You talked about mods, and I was wondering, if you have like a game or software where you include things created by other people, what are your responsibilities? And kind of simple line being like, oh, these mods were created by the community, I have no control over it, so it's not my problem. I mean, obviously you have ethical problems then to solve, yeah. But what is, in terms of legalities, what?
Yeah, that really depends whether it's proprietary or that it's someone who made something who make it available open source, of course. If you just use things from other people, they have copyright over it and they can forbid it. We always think about fair use, but please know that fair use is a defense right in the United States of America. In Europe, we only have like an exemption that if it's a really small infringement, which is incidental and just once, then it cannot be it can't be a problem. But in this case, if you use something for someone else, they can just ask you to remove it or can even claim damages. So it's not that, well, I use something for someone else and it's allowed if I do it little or much. So that's something at least to take into account. If you want to use it for any other purposes without approval, you need to have a legal right to do it. And there is a lot of misconception about this because it really depends on the case-by-case basis. For example, we say parody, but I can't use make a game like Candy Crush with fruits and then say it's parody because this is the healthy variant. Because especially if you make money with it, then the parody exception doesn't apply often in Europe. So it really depends on the situation. But that's a typical lawyer answer, I fear. No more questions? And if you have questions, like I said, 101, I will be here all day. I will be here the remaining of tomorrow as well. So just like hit me up, I don't bite. We can have a conversation and then we can have a one-on-one. And if you think like, hey, I really have a question, I don't feel comfortable even that people see me talking to you, we can go outside or we can schedule something after this event as well. Like I said, I have a Calendly and 4 hours a week I do free legal consultations for starting devs and people from marginalized groups as well. So if that's something that you prefer, feel free to reach out.